The Galactic Consual was a body of civilizations who saw themselves as the architects of order, their fleets charting every lane and their decrees binding worlds together. They spoke of unity and structure, of rules that applied to all who lived under the light of the stars. Yet among the endless regions claimed and catalogued, there stretched a vast silence. It was a region no official maps detailed, a sector left in muted tones as though forgotten. The absence was not a matter of oversight, it was deliberate. Travelers whispered of its boundaries, merchants spoke in hushed tones when their routes brought them near, and older diplomats advised the young never to look too closely. The space belonged to Terrans, and every inscription carved on ancient relay stations carried a warning: no vessel not of Earth should cross. The Consual dismissed these accounts as superstition from a less enlightened age. They valued charts and treaties, not fear woven into rumor. The warning seemed primitive to their scholars, nothing more than the product of a species too reclusive to embrace civilization's higher order. Terran silence in the face of outreach was painted as arrogance or backwardness. In closed chambers, the rhetoric became sharper: no world could remain sovereign outside the grasp of the Consual. To yield such independence was to allow chaos a seed from which rebellion might grow. They convinced themselves that a demonstration of authority would not only bring Terrans into line but also serve as a reminder to other species watching from the margins. Still, unease lingered even among the proud. There were records of fleets dispatched centuries earlier, expeditions meant to open dialogue or establish trade, that had never returned. The logs ended abruptly, as though erased by a hand unwilling to record failure. Those who raised such points were drowned out by voices demanding action. A myth, the counselors declared. Ghost stories spun by cowards unwilling to test themselves against the unknown. Arrogance outweighed prudence, and the decision was made: the forbidden zone would be entered, surveyed, and claimed as territory of the Consual. For the crews ordered to participate, confidence masked anxiety. They had seen the glyphs that adorned borderway stations, human symbols carved with unnatural precision, messages translated into dozens of tongues, always carrying the same phrase: "You were warned." Such bluntness seemed almost laughable in its lack of subtlety, yet the directness carried weight that unsettled even seasoned veterans. What kind of civilization left words instead of warships, yet saw entire sectors respected as theirs? No blockade fields, no defensive patrols, only silence, and still the silence held power. The commanders assured their subordinates that hesitation was weakness. They presented the campaign as routine expansion, no different than compelling a minor polity to sign the Consual Charter. What they did not say aloud was that every species conquered before had at least attempted negotiation. Terrans had offered none. In every diplomatic archive, there was not a single instance of them speaking in the halls of the Consual or submitting proposals to trade committees. They existed apart, their worlds unvisited, their industries unseen, their fleets uncounted. The unknown was always more frightening than the known, and in the vacuum of facts, the galaxy had filled the silence with legends. On the appointed day, the vast armada assembled at the edge of the void. Thousands of ships gleamed under artificial suns, banners and insignias displayed in ritualistic bravado. The counselors who attended viewed the spectacle with satisfaction, convinced that history would remember this as the moment the last independent power was bent to unity. Engines flared, formations aligned, and the order was given. The void swallowed them, and the crossing began. As the fleet entered Terran space, there was no interception, no beacon of challenge, no signal of acknowledgement. The stars themselves seemed dimmer, as if the region absorbed vitality. Sensors registered nothing but emptiness, though every officer felt the weight of unseen eyes. The silence of the zone was not passive but deliberate, the quiet of a predator waiting for the intruder to take another step. Some whispered that the absence of resistance was itself a warning, more chilling than open hostility. Yet the Consual pressed forward, dismissing dread as cowardice. Each vessel's chronometer marked the crossing as an achievement, a claim to be recited in future reports. To those at the heart of the Council, it was proof of their supremacy, confirmation that Terran sovereignty was nothing but a myth to be erased. They could not grasp that the absence of challenge was not weakness but strategy. The Consual had been warned, again and again, but their pride had deafened them. The ships moved deeper into the silence, and with every passing hour the line between confidence and arrogance blurred further. They had stepped into a realm that did not forgive trespass, a domain where sovereignty was not enforced by council decrees but by something far older, sharper, and infinitely less forgiving. And though they could not see it, the moment of judgment was already approaching. The advance of the Consual fleet into Terran space began with triumph in their hearts and certainty in their calculations. Thousands of ships glided in formation, every hull gleaming with the pride of civilizations that had long believed themselves untouchable. Admirals issued precise orders, confident that the void would bend to their will as every other frontier had before. Yet the deeper they pressed into the silent expanse, the more unsettling the stillness became. Space had a weight here that none of their instruments could explain, a density of quiet that settled over crews like an invisible pressure. Every pulse of radar, every sweep of scanners returned emptiness, but the emptiness itself felt deliberate, as though designed to mock their probing eyes. At first, the silence was taken as opportunity. Commanders relayed assurances that Terrans had no defenses, no capacity to resist a force of such magnitude. Their rhetoric framed the operation as a cleansing of superstition, an act that would prove to all species that the Consual's authority could not be denied. Yet among the ranks, whispers spread. Veterans who had fought across dozens of systems began to recall stories heard in outposts. Tales of Terrans not as weak but as predators who had survived wars that would have extinguished any other race. The further they traveled, the more those tales began to feel less like myths and more like warnings they should have heeded. When the first contact came, it was almost laughable in its simplicity. A single drone emerged from the void, so small and insignificant against the Armada's vastness that it seemed absurd to grant it notice. Its design was plain, utilitarian, lacking the ornamentation of Consual craft. The only thing remarkable about it was the transmission it carried, a tight-beamed signal that slipped through every defense protocol without obstruction. The words appeared on every console in flawless translation. * You were warned. Turn back. * The message bore no flourish, no attempt at persuasion. It was a statement of fact delivered with chilling finality. Officers laughed, dismissing it as bravado from a hidden relay, but the unease in their voices betrayed them. The order was given to destroy the drone, and in an instant it disintegrated under a barrage of fire. Yet its brief presence had pierced their arrogance, leaving behind a silence heavier than before. As the fleet pushed deeper, anomalies began to unfold. Ships reported minor navigational errors, small deviations from plotted courses, insignificant on their own but unnervingly persistent. Instruments misread gravitational fields, and systems that had never failed before required constant recalibration. Communications that should have been instantaneous developed strange delays, fragments of messages arriving out of order, as if intercepted and reassembled imperfectly. Commanders insisted these were technical malfunctions, but patterns emerged too deliberate to dismiss. Entire vessels vanished from formation, their signals cutting off mid-report with no distress call, no trace left behind. Search sweeps returned nothing. The official line called it spatial distortion, but among the crews the word, taken, spread like wildfire. Despite mounting evidence, arrogance refused to yield. Admirals reminded their forces that the Consual had faced countless obstacles before, and always they had prevailed. They emphasized discipline, forbade speculation, and pressed further. Yet discipline could not smother the dread that grew with each disappearance. Officers began to speak in hushed tones about being observed. Engineers swore systems responded to commands before they were given, as though something unseen anticipated their every move. Even seasoned warriors began to avoid idle chatter, speaking only when duty required, fearing that unseen ears might be listening. The weight of legend pressed down with every hour. The stories that once seemed like fabrications now aligned with the evidence before their eyes. The absence of Terran fleets no longer appeared as weakness but as mastery. To conceal such power in plain silence required intent far beyond arrogance. The truth began to crystallize, though none dared admit it aloud. Terrans were watching, gauging every move, and choosing patience over confrontation. The drone's message had not been a bluff. It had been the opening note of a symphony of intimidation that grew louder with each vanishing ship, each failed system, each unanswered call. When another drone appeared, this time at the heart of the fleet, no one laughed. Its approach was undetected until it was already there, hovering silently amid thousands of warships, impervious to scans or targeting locks. It transmitted no words, only repeated the previous warning in an endless loop, as if reminding them that their arrogance had brought them this far and that their time to withdraw was almost gone. The commanders blustered, yet their crews saw the tremor in their voices, the cracks in their certainty. In that moment, it became clear to every observer that the Terrans had allowed the Consual inside their borders not out of weakness but to make a point. The invaders had been granted just enough rope to bind themselves in fear. The silence was no longer emptiness but the sound of a predator circling unseen, waiting for the precise moment to strike. The fleet's unraveling began without warning, a shift so sudden it shattered the illusion of control that the admirals had clung to. At first, a single cruiser went dark, its lights extinguishing as though swallowed whole. Moments later, half a dozen more lost all functionality, their systems shutting down without a single shot fired. Across the command networks, panic erupted as officers screamed for status reports that never arrived. No debris, no explosions, only silence where proud vessels had once been. The pattern was unmistakable. This was not failure, but attack, and it was executed with precision no one had thought possible. Their weapons had always been the centerpiece of Consual confidence, calibrated to pierce shields, vaporize armor, and dominate lesser species into compliance. Now, those weapons refused to obey. Launch sequences froze mid-cycle, targeting arrays refused to lock, and power surges overloaded firing systems before they could activate. The invaders realized too late that the very instruments of their superiority had been subverted. Terran intrusion was invisible yet absolute, their code unraveling every defense with an elegance that defied comprehension. The battlefield was no longer measured in distance and firepower but in control of data, and in that arena, the humans were unchallenged masters. Crew members who attempted manual overrides were met with displays flickering into strange symbols, half their own language and half something alien, mocking in its clarity. Words scrolled across screens. Leave while you can. To some, it felt like voices in their minds, though no transmissions could be traced. Engineers reported systems responding before commands were issued, as if their ships themselves had been possessed by unseen hands. Fear spread faster than any fire, because they understood that no barricade of metal or shielding could resist this form of assault. Then came the first visible strike. Not a grand barrage or a shining fleet, but the sudden appearance of a single human vessel. It emerged without distortion, without detectable warp, simply there where none had seen it arrive. Its shape was unlike anything the galaxy had built, angular, sharp-edged, matte surfaces designed not to intimidate with grandeur but to vanish in darkness. Compared to the vast Consual warships, it seemed small, but its presence radiated precision. Before the invaders could react, a command ship at the fleet's center erupted from within, not blasted apart but gutted by systems tearing themselves loose under unseen manipulation. The human vessel drifted silently away, untouched, as if the destruction it caused required no effort at all. Panic consumed the Consual ranks. Squadrons broke formation, desperate to engage an enemy they could neither track nor anticipate. Yet for every attempt at counterattack, 2 more ships went silent, their crews cut off from life support or their reactors cold and lifeless in seconds. Admirals shouted orders, demanding unity, but their words reached only fragments of their forces. Communications collapsed under the weight of interference that bent every signal back upon itself. For the first time in generations, the Consual's greatest war machine had been reduced to isolated fragments, each vessel trapped in its own prison of fear. More human ships appeared, never in overwhelming numbers, always in pairs or threes, striking like hunters. They ignored the strongest vessels at first, targeting logistics craft, command nodes, and carriers, severing the fleet's ability to coordinate. Their weapons were not vast beams or thundering projectiles but precise bursts of energy that sliced through hulls with surgical efficiency. One by one, critical ships fell, leaving survivors adrift. Those who attempted surrender received no reply, only silence, followed by disconnection as their ships powered down forever. The realization swept over even the most arrogant commanders. The Terrans had never needed to confront them in open battle. This was not war as the Consual understood it. This was dismemberment, an autopsy performed on a living armada, each strike exposing how unprepared they were to face an opponent forged by centuries of survival against themselves. Humans did not seek glory in fleet clashes. They sought results, and they achieved them with an efficiency that felt less like combat and more like inevitability. The retreat order was inevitable, but even that was not salvation. Of the thousands who had entered the Forbidden Zone, only fragments would see its edge again. Survivors spoke in trembling voices of the final transmission that flooded every remaining channel as they fled. Last warning. Leave and never return. The words were delivered without flourish, cold in their certainty, undeniable in their authority. Those who escaped carried the scars of humiliation etched into their memory, knowing their defeat had not been the result of overwhelming numbers but of a power that fought on terms no one else could match. The Consual had entered Terran space to claim dominance, and in doing so, they had learned the meaning of insignificance. The shattered remnants limped back toward familiar stars, the silence behind them heavy with the promise that they had not been spared out of mercy, but only because the Terrans had chosen to let them go. The return of the survivors was not celebrated with ceremony but cloaked in shame. The once proud fleet that had set out with banners and proclamations limped back fractured and hollow, carrying fragments of vessels and crews too shaken to look their superiors in the eye. Council chambers that had anticipated triumph now echoed with disbelief as commanders stumbled to reports that defied conventional logic. They spoke of weapons that never fired, ships that died without combat, enemies who fought without appearing, and a silence more crushing than any bombardment. For many counselors, it was easier to call these accounts exaggeration born of panic than to accept what the evidence made plain. Humanity had dismantled the Consual's greatest fleet without exposing the full measure of its strength. Arguments erupted immediately. Some demanded vengeance, calling for a second armada to restore honor and crush the humans before their reputation grew unchecked. Their words dripped with desperation, but beneath them lay fear of what would happen if the galaxy perceived the Consual as weak. Others countered that no honor could be restored through annihilation, that to provoke Terrans further was to invite extinction. These voices reminded the chamber that survivors described not battles but demonstrations, as though the humans had chosen restraint, dismantling without slaughtering outright. Such precision suggested capability far beyond what had been witnessed, leaving the possibility that what had been revealed was only the surface of their power. Testimonies from returning officers deepened the divide. One described consoles filling with human words no algorithm could block. Another recalled hearing their own systems respond before they issued commands, as though human intent outpaced alien thought. Engineers swore that entire reactors shut down in ways physically impossible, as if the laws of mechanics themselves had bent under Terran control. These accounts were not easily dismissed, for they repeated the same details across ships that had been isolated from one another. To fabricate such unity of narrative would have required coordination the survivors could not have achieved. In the quieter corners of debate, scholars who had studied human history presented their findings to the assembly. They painted a picture of a species forged in conflict, not by conquering neighbors across stars but by surviving their own relentless struggles. Millennia of warfare on a single world had honed them, leaving scars etched in both technology and culture. They had built machines capable of ending themselves and then learned to live in the shadow of that knowledge. While other species advanced through harmony or expansion, humanity had advanced through fire, adapting faster with every near collapse. What the fleet had faced was not a young race guarding primitive pride, but the distilled product of countless generations that had treated survival as an art and war as a science. The revelations forced the Consual to confront its own assumptions. Authority had been maintained by overwhelming presence, by towering fleets and the promise of punishment. Against Terrans, that formula had dissolved. The humans had not confronted numbers with numbers but had turned precision, patience, and control into weapons sharper than any blade of plasma. To admit this truth was to accept that the Consual's model of power had limits, and that realization threatened the very structure of their rule. Reluctantly, pragmatism outweighed pride. A decree was passed declaring Terran space beyond jurisdiction, a zone to be avoided under penalty of exile. Publicly, it was framed as a diplomatic concession, a temporary measure while further studies were conducted. Privately, it was an acknowledgement that no force in the galaxy could compel Terrans without unacceptable cost. The very act of issuing the decree bruised the Consual's image, for it was the first time they had bent to another power rather than demanded compliance. Yet it was necessary, for even the most arrogant counselors knew that survival of the institution depended on avoiding a second humiliation. The chamber fell quiet after the decree, but silence did not bring comfort. The survivors carried fear etched into their faces, and ambassadors from lesser species whispered among themselves that perhaps humanity had earned its seclusion. Rumors spread swiftly, tales of ships vanishing, systems collapsing, and voices that could not be silenced. Within weeks, the galaxy at large treated Terran territory not as unexplored space but as cursed ground, forbidden not by law but by instinct. The Consual had set out to teach humanity submission, but instead they had taught the galaxy to fear a silence far more absolute than their proclamations. Humanity had not appeared to explain or negotiate, had not even acknowledged their victory. They had let the invaders flee with enough survivors to spread the story, ensuring their reputation was carried without effort. In that calculated absence, the Terrans had achieved something the Consual never had, authority unspoken yet absolute. Weeks passed before the final word arrived. The Consual's chambers had settled into uneasy quiet, pretending that the humiliation of retreat could be concealed beneath layers of protocol and new decrees. They convinced themselves that the silence of the Terrans meant the crisis had ended, that perhaps humanity wished only to be left alone. That illusion shattered when every communicator across the Council and its allied worlds activated in perfect unison. No override could interrupt it, no device could silence it. The message was simple, the delivery flawless, reaching every tongue in its native form, yet carrying the same cadence and weight. Asterisk, your fleet was spared only because you turned back. This was your first and last trespass. Asterisk. The voice was faceless, calm, measured, with no hint of rage or boast. It did not argue or threaten. It stated. The words carried the finality of natural law, the kind of truth that did not invite negotiation. For those who had pressed hardest for vengeance, their blood ran cold. They had called for displays of defiance, but now they realized such defiance would not be met with battle, it would be met with obliteration. The voice continued, each phrase etched into the collective mind of the chamber. Asterisk, humanity does not seek conquest. Humanity will never kneel. Enter again, and you will not leave. Asterisk, then the transmission ended, leaving silence more suffocating than the warning itself. The weight of the message was not in its length but in its reach. The Council had struggled for centuries to unify species, constantly negotiating language, custom, and interpretation. The Terrans had erased all barriers in a single broadcast. Every delegate heard it as if spoken personally, as if the human tongue had been born from their own minds. To achieve such clarity was more than mastery of technology. It was demonstration of intent, a reminder that the humans chose to be understood perfectly so that no excuse for misinterpretation could exist. Fear was not the only response. Respect grew in corners of the chamber where survival had always outweighed pride. Those voices argued that what humanity had declared was not tyranny but sovereignty, a line drawn without malice but with immovable strength. The message had not spoken of conquest, had not demanded tribute or submission, but had made unmistakably clear that trespass would bring destruction. In that distinction lay the difference between empire and dominion. Terrans claimed no crown over the galaxy, but over their space they allowed no rival, no condition, no compromise. Among lesser civilizations, the effect was even greater. Word of the transmission spread faster than the Council could contain it. Merchants whispered of it on border stations, smugglers spoke of it with awe, and minor polities began marking Terran space on their maps not as unexplored but as forbidden. The warning became legend, told in every port, reinforced by the memory of a fleet shattered without battle. In the galaxy's collective imagination, humanity transformed overnight from a silent enigma to a power beyond challenge. They had spoken once, and that was enough. Inside the Consual, debates dwindled. Every faction understood that no vote could undo the reality imposed upon them. They could convene endless sessions, draft countless resolutions, and still the truth remained: the humans had imposed their will not through treaties or armies, but through certainty. No threat loomed more heavily than one delivered without bluster. The restraint of the Terrans became more terrifying than if they had annihilated the fleet outright. Mercy implied control so complete that destruction could be chosen or withheld at will. In the weeks that followed, no further communication came from Terran space. Their silence resumed, heavy and deliberate. Patrols who approached their borders reported nothing unusual: no war fleets, no patrols, no activity at all. Yet no one dared to cross the line again. The absence itself became their strongest weapon. In a galaxy accustomed to constant motion, the quiet of Terran space loomed like a storm cloud never breaking, reminding all who lived beyond it of the price of arrogance. For the Consual, the consequences were irreversible. Their image as supreme arbiters had been broken, not by open conquest but by the unyielding sovereignty of a species that refused to play by their rules. Pride had been their downfall, and in failing to heed the warnings, they had provided humanity the opportunity to reveal only enough of their power to cement their legend. They were no longer spoken of as a potential ally or reluctant member but as a force outside the Council's influence, sovereign in a way that no law or decree could challenge. The final impression left in every mind was not of ships vanishing or systems collapsing, but of a voice, calm, cold, beyond appeal, declaring that the line had been drawn. The galaxy understood then that Terran territory was not protected by fleets or treaties but by the will of humanity itself. And in that will lay something more unshakable than any empire: the certainty that some borders were never meant to be crossed.